Look straight at the screen for a second, because the ache you feel right now isn't weakness. It's evidence that someone is thinking about you and refusing to say your name out loud. That silence, it's not peace, it's restraint. And restraint always cracks. Before we go deeper, if this kind of psychological truth matters to you, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Because what you're about to hear changes how you see every relationship you've ever had. I'm speaking to you as a psychologist, but also as a woman who understands the quiet places of the mind. When someone misses you in silence, it's rarely because they don't care. It's because caring threatens their identity. Their ego tells them that reaching out would mean losing control, losing status, or admitting they misjudged you. So they perform strength while privately negotiating with regret. That negotiation happens late at night, when distractions fade and the nervous system stops lying. Here's the truth most men are never told. Silence is not the absence of attachment. It's often attachment under surveillance. They replay moments with you, not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary details, the way you listened, the way you didn't need to prove anything. Those memories are dangerous to the ego because they contradict the story they told themselves when they walked away. Ego survives on narratives. I'm fine. I moved on. This was my decision. Missing you threatens that narrative, so the mind delays action. It substitutes pride for connection. But pride is metabolically expensive. It takes energy to suppress emotion, and the body always keeps score. Irritability, restlessness, sudden nostalgia, these are not accidents. They are symptoms of emotional debt. And here's where unease enters. The longer they stay silent, the louder the internal pressure becomes. Not because you did anything, but because unresolved attachment erodes self-image. Eventually, the ego faces a choice: admit longing or fracture. That fracture doesn't look like tears at first. It looks like impulsive decisions, comparisons, and an obsessive need to be seen as winning. You don't need to chase this. Your absence is already doing the work. Silence, when paired with dignity, becomes a mirror. And what they see there is not your loss. It's their own. Stay grounded. Keep your standards intact, and remember this: emotional gravity favors those who don't beg, don't explain, and don't abandon themselves while waiting for validation, attention, or closure that arrives. What they never admit is that missing you threatens the version of themselves they worked hard to protect. The ego is not confidence, it's armor, and armor gets heavy when worn too long. When they chose silence, they didn't choose peace. They chose a daily performance where they must act unbothered while their nervous system reacts as if something essential is missing. As a psychologist, I see this pattern constantly. People don't miss loudly when their self-image is on the line. They miss quietly, strategically, hoping the feeling will fade before it forces a confession. But emotions don't disappear through denial. They go underground, where they gain pressure, and pressure always looks for an exit. This is why they check your social media without engaging, why your name surfaces in unrelated conversations, why they compare everyone new to you, even when they swear they've moved on. Missing you becomes an internal contradiction. If they miss you, then leaving wasn't as clean as they claimed. And if leaving wasn't clean, then their judgment is questioned. The ego hates that more than loneliness. Here's the part most men misunderstand. Ego collapse doesn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happens slowly, in private. It's the realization that distractions don't work anymore. That validation from others feels hollow. That no amount of busyness replaces emotional resonance. They don't miss you because of what you gave them materially or physically. They miss you because you represented a version of themselves that felt more grounded, more seen, more real. Silence becomes their last defense. If they don't speak, they don't have to confront the possibility that they lost something irreplaceable. But silence has a cost. The longer it continues, the more their internal world destabilizes. Confidence becomes performative. Control becomes obsession. And the ego, once protective, starts turning inward, criticizing instead of defending. You may feel the urge to reach out, to ease the tension, to make sense of the quiet. Understand this. Breaking your own boundary to soothe someone else's ego delays the lesson they need to learn. Your absence is not punishment, it's clarity. It forces them to sit with the emotional truth they tried to outrun. And when the ego begins to crack, it's not because you chased them, it's because you didn't. The human mind values what it cannot dominate. Respect grows where control fails. Missing you in silence is the prelude. Ego collapse is what happens when the mind realizes it can no longer rewrite history to protect pride. You don't need to prove your worth during this phase. Your restraint already has. Stay centered. Let time and psychological gravity do what persuasion never could. There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when their internal story stops working. The one where they told themselves they were stronger without you, freer without you, untouched by the separation. That story holds until reality interrupts it. And reality interrupts through emotion, not logic. They begin to feel something they can't rationalize away, the absence of emotional safety. As a woman and a psychologist, I need you to hear this clearly. What people miss most is not the person. It's how they felt about themselves in that person's presence. When you were consistent, grounded, and emotionally present, you became a stabilizing reference point. Losing that doesn't hurt immediately. It destabilizes slowly, like removing a beam from a structure and expecting the house to stand. They start to notice the difference in small ways. Conversations feel shallow. Laughter doesn't land the same. Conflicts feel louder, more exhausting. And in those moments, their mind reaches for a familiar emotional frequency, yours. That's when the silence gets heavier, because reaching out would mean admitting that the new life doesn't feel as solid as advertised. Ego resists this realization by reframing. I just miss the routine. It wasn't that special. Anyone could replace that. But the nervous system doesn't respond to lies. It responds to loss. And loss shows up as agitation, restlessness, or a low-grade sadness they can't name. That's the ego losing its grip on the narrative. Here's where things turn uncomfortable for them. Missing you starts to interfere with their self-concept. If they miss you this much, then the connection mattered. And if the connection mattered, then their silence becomes evidence of avoidance, not strength. That's a painful mirror to look into. So they avoid. They delay, they watch from a distance. Silence becomes surveillance, not to move on, but to stay emotionally connected without risking rejection or accountability. This is not indifference. It's fear disguised as composure. For you, this phase is dangerous only if you misunderstand it. You might assume silence means you were forgettable. Psychologically, the opposite is often true. Silence can mean you left a mark deep enough to threaten the ego's control. The deeper the mark, the longer the avoidance. Your power here is non-reactivity, not coldness, not games. Calm self-respect. When you don't chase, explain, or collapse into anxiety, you become undeniable. You force them to confront the truth without distraction. And here's the truth they don't say out loud. Missing you feels like losing control over their emotional narrative. Ego collapse begins when they realize that control was never real. It was borrowed from your presence. And now that presence is gone, the illusion starts to fracture quietly, relentlessly, until something gives. When the ego begins to weaken, it doesn't announce itself. It disguises the shift as indifference, confidence, even superiority. But beneath that surface, something far more fragile is happening. They are realizing that silence didn't erase you, it amplified you. Every day they didn't speak became another day their mind filled in the gaps with memory, imagination, and regret. This is where psychological tension peaks. The ego wants dominance, certainty, and control. Missing you offers none of those. It creates vulnerability without permission. And vulnerability is terrifying to anyone who equates emotional exposure with loss of power. So instead of reaching out, they tighten their posture. They double down on appearances. They act busier, louder, more distracted. But internally, they are negotiating with a truth they don't want to face. They begin asking themselves questions they never planned to answer. Why does nothing feel as steady? Why do I think about them when I finally slow down? Why does my pride feel heavier than my loneliness? These questions don't come all at once. They arrive in fragments, in moments of stillness the ego can't fully silence. As a psychologist, I see this stage as the tipping point. The mind can no longer pretend that the connection was insignificant. Emotional memory doesn't fade on command. It fades through resolution. And silence is not resolution, it's postponement. the longer it continues, the more emotionally expensive it becomes. What makes this phase unbearable for them is that you are no longer accessible in the way you once were. You're not arguing, you're not pleading, you're not explaining. That absence of emotional labor forces them to confront themselves without distraction, and most people are not prepared for that level of self-reflection. They start to sense that if they reached out now, it wouldn't be from power, it would be from need. And the ego hates acting from need. It wants leverage, it wants certainty. But time removes leverage. The longer the silence, the greater the risk that you've emotionally recalibrated without them. This realization accelerates the internal collapse. Control slips. Confidence becomes brittle. The image they projected no longer matches how they feel. And that gap creates anxiety, not because they lost you, but because they lost the version of themselves that felt secure. For you, the lesson is simple and difficult. Do nothing that interrupts this process. Don't rescue them from their discomfort. Growth requires friction. Closure requires honesty. And ego collapse is not cruelty, it's clarity. Your calm, grounded presence, even in absence, becomes the contrast that exposes their internal chaos. And when the ego finally gives way, it's not because you demanded anything. It's because silence made the truth unavoidable. At some point, the ego runs out of explanations. Distraction stops working, new attention feels thin, and the silence they once used as protection starts to feel like self-betrayal. This is where things shift internally, even if nothing has changed on the surface. They are no longer choosing silence. They are enduring it. The mind begins to loop, not obsessively at first, but persistently. Certain memories return with precision. The way you responded under pressure, the way you didn't shrink or overextend, the way your presence regulated chaos instead of creating it. These aren't romanticized fantasies. They're emotional data, and emotional data is hard to dismiss once the nervous system recognizes it. Here's a truth most men are never taught. When someone loses access to emotional regulation they didn't know they relied on, the ego panics. They don't think, "I miss them." They think, "Why do I feel off?" But the source is the same. You were a stabilizer, not because you tried to be, but because you were consistent, grounded, and self-contained. The ego tries one last maneuver here, rewriting the story again. Timing was wrong. I wasn't ready. It wouldn't have worked anyway. These narratives aren't lies, they're defenses. The mind clings to them to avoid the deeper realization that walking away cost more than expected. What intensifies the collapse is the awareness that you are not waiting in emotional limbo. Even if they don't know your life, they sense your detachment. Emotional bonds don't require proximity to be felt. They require contrast. And your absence, paired with composure, becomes undeniable contrast. This is when silence becomes unbearable, not because they need you, but because the ego can't reconcile losing someone without proof that it was the right decision, and proof never arrives. There is no moment where regret neatly resolves itself. There is only the slow acceptance that control was an illusion. They may rehearse messages they never send. They may imagine conversations where they sound confident, unaffected, in charge. But imagination doesn't soothe the nervous system. Only truth does. And truth requires humility. For you, this is the phase where restraint becomes strength. Not because you're withholding, but because you're no longer entangled. You've returned your focus inward. That shift changes the emotional equation entirely. When the ego finally collapses, it doesn't shatter loudly. It yields. It accepts uncertainty. And in that yielding, something honest emerges. Sometimes too late, sometimes just in time, but always earned. You don't need to anticipate it. Your role was never to convince. It was to be real, and real leaves an imprint silence can't erase. When the ego finally loosens its grip, something unfamiliar takes its place. Humility. Not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet recognition that avoidance didn't equal strength. That silence wasn't mastery. It was fear, dressed as composure. This realization doesn't feel empowering to them. It feels destabilizing, because now they must confront a version of themselves they didn't plan to meet. They start to understand that missing you wasn't the problem. Pretending they didn't was. The energy it took to suppress that truth drained them slowly, affecting their mood, their focus, their confidence. And once that energy is gone, the emotional truth surfaces without resistance. They don't romanticize you anymore. They respect you, and respect is heavier than desire. This is where their internal dialogue changes. It's no longer about winning, proving, or being right. It becomes about accountability. They begin to see how pride interfered with connection, how control replaced curiosity, how silence became a shield instead of a bridge. These insights don't come from you explaining anything. They come from absence doing what presence no longer can. What's uncomfortable for them now is the awareness that reaching out would require emotional honesty, not leverage. They can't perform confidence anymore. They would have to show up as they are, without certainty of outcome. And that's terrifying to someone who relied on ego to manage risk. You might never see this internal shift. Ego collapse is often invisible externally, but you may sense a change in energy, hesitation, softness, a different tone if they do speak. That's not strategy, that's recalibration, the mind adjusting to a truth it can no longer avoid. For you, this stage demands emotional maturity, not excitement, not anticipation, neutral clarity, because when someone approaches you after ego collapse, they're not offering certainty, they're offering vulnerability. And vulnerability is not a promise, it's a moment. The power you hold now isn't about whether they return, it's about whether you recognize your own growth. You didn't lose yourself trying to be chosen. You didn't chase clarity from someone avoiding their own. You stayed intact. That's why the dynamic has shifted. Not because they finally saw your worth, but because you never abandoned it. Ego collapse doesn't guarantee reunion. Sometimes it only guarantees respect. And respect, even at a distance, is a form of closure many never receive. If they come back, it will not be with confidence, it will be with truth. And if they don't, know this: the silence did its work, not to punish them, but to reveal you. What remains after ego collapse is clarity, not relief, not victory, just a sober understanding of what was lost, what was protected, and what can never be undone. This is the part no one talks about, because it doesn't flatter anyone. When the noise fades, when pride steps aside, the truth stands alone, and it's quiet. They realize something fundamental. You were not replaceable because you were never competing. You weren't an option filling a role. You were a presence that altered their internal baseline. And once the nervous system adjusts to a certain level of emotional safety, it never forgets it. That's why missing you never fully stopped. It only changed shape. Here's the final truth they rarely admit, even to themselves. Losing you didn't hurt because of loneliness. It hurt because it exposed a gap between who they thought they were and how they actually behaved. Ego collapse is the mind's way of reconciling that gap, and reconciliation always comes with loss. Some people reach out at this stage, not dramatically, not confidently, but carefully. Others don't, not because they don't care, but because the realization arrived too late, and they know it. Either way, the outcome is no longer in their control, and that's the part that humbles them most. For you, this is the end of the psychological loop. You stop interpreting silence as a message about your worth. You stop waiting for proof, validation, or admission. You understand that some realizations happen privately, and some apologies are never spoken, but still felt. As a psychologist, I'll tell you this: closure is not something someone gives you. It's something you reach when your self-respect outweighs your need to be understood. You don't need them to admit they missed you. You don't need their ego to collapse in front of you. It already did, in the only place that mattered. What you gained from this wasn't loss, it was alignment. You learned that your presence has weight, that your absence has impact, and that you don't need to force recognition for it to exist. So if you're still feeling the echo of that silence, let it pass through you without resistance. It's not unfinished business, it's evidence of growth, yours and theirs. And remember this as you move forward: the people who miss you in silence do so because speaking would require them to face themselves. You faced yourself. That's why you're free. Hold that standard, protect that calm, and never shrink your truth to keep someone else's ego intact again.